Okay, all right. Can you tell me when we're live, Brooks, or somebody?
We are now.
Oh, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tessa Evans Campbell, the school's Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and I'm delighted to see you all here today. Thank you so much for coming. In this season of Gathering Remotely, we are excited to host this very special online lecture series, The Leading Lights. It features distinguished scholars and teachers at our school who are leading the way to systemic social change. This special series, created by Eddie O'Hara, the Balmer Endowed Dean in Social Work, features 1-hour lectures by top scholars and teachers at the UW School of Social Work who have made foundational contributions to the field. The sessions were designed as a special offering to our MSW students in the entering class of 2020, with other students, alumni, and friends invited to attend. The series offers students and others a way to introduce esteemed faculty and their work during a time of remote instruction. We know that you will all find these presentations illuminating, thought-provoking, and inspiring. The series will run through late 2021. As soon as we have all the dates and names for the future speakers, we will publicize them through our usual channels. And after the session, a 30-minute student-only question and answer session with the speaker will follow each lecture. Today, I am absolutely thrilled that we're kicking off this series with a talk by our beloved colleague, Steve Wilson, who happens to be the 2020 Washington State Social Work Educator of the Year. I just want to say a special thank you to Steve. We are so excited to hear from you. And I think Mike is going to introduce Steve. You're on mute, Mike.
Thanks, Tessa. Sorry, everyone, I was on mute. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. When we talk about this series and we talk about lecture series and things of that nature, sometimes you save the best for last. Well, in this case, we decided we're going to start off with one of our very, very best. And let me just start off by introducing Dr. Stephen T. Wilson. He holds a position right now as a lecturer at our school. And he also received his MSW at the University of Washington. So he is a Husky alumni as well. Went on to get his PhD at Smith College. And he has been practicing clinical social work primarily with children in the area of children and families mental health and with children of color. He has won numerous honors, including the Washington State Educator of the Year Award, Social Worker Award, and he's also won awards in our BASW program and our MSW program for his excellence in teaching. Definitely a consensus favorite teacher among our students. And I'm so happy that all of you are able to get to hear him today because his classes are not necessarily offered to all students. One of the things that I just want to say personally about Steve is, I've only known him now for a couple of years because I recently came to the University of Washington, but in the couple of years that I've gotten to know him, we've taught us similar courses together, and I've gotten to know him, and he is such a special human being. I'm just honored to hear him speak today. Whenever when I look at his list of awards, I know he has a lot of people in his life who has supported him along the way, but we have a common mentor as well. So whenever I see Steve's accomplishments, I smile inside too, because I know that we're all doing the same thing to honor, our mentors, honor our ancestors, and such. And so, before I turn the floor over to Steve, I just want to say that, and Steve will be doing an acknowledgement as well, but I want to acknowledge that the University of Washington does sit on Puget Sound Salish lands, and that we honor those individuals. And I personally am committed to not only the indigenous populations that live in this area, but to all Black, Indigenous, and communities of color as a mentor, teacher, and through my research. So having said that, I want to turn the floor over to the wonderful Stephen Wilson.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to give honor to the Coast Salish Squaxin Island tribal lands, which I'm standing on. And without them, we wouldn't be here. So thank you so much. The next thing I want to do, because it is part of my tradition as a person of African descent, and that is one to look back and to give honor to the people who came before me. And I am here because I'm standing on their shoulders. The Sankofa bird, the legend of the Sankofa bird, is one where there's a bird flying forward while looking backwards and grabbing onto an egg. And the statement of Sankofa is always good to go back and get what was lost. And so it is for the people who came before me and for the ones who are coming after me that I am doing this today. It is my privilege and honor. So I'd like to start out with a person who's really near to me and dear to me. Actually, she's passed away a number of years ago, but her name is Miss Inez Bailey. And I want to start by saying that I come from a tradition. I was raised in the American South by two parents who were from the South. And so I'm going to give title to people. And so I always called Miss Bailey, Miss Bailey. Never called her Miss Inez Bailey. Her son called her Inez, but I would never do that because it would be disrespectful where I'm from. But Miss Inez Bailey was a social worker. She was born in Monroe, Louisiana, and then she came west, and she got married and had 4 children, and then became a single mom and was raising them in the Mill Valley area of California. And this is Mill Valley down here in the lower right. But she was also concerned that because Mill Valley in Marin County was largely Black, what she realized in comparison to a largely Black area, in comparison to the small Black area, the rest of the county was largely white, and that the Black students and the Black kids were not receiving the same sorts of services. And so what she did was she decided to start Operation Give a Damn. And essentially what it was a program that was enrichment. It was tutoring. It was designed to provide spaces for Black children to get additional education, to go on field trips in the area so that they would learn about the history, her story, their story that was theirs in the region. And one of the ways that she spoke with me about why she had started OGAD, and she said that at one point in time when she was working with kids in Marin City, she said, the kids said, why are you talking about this? No one gives a damn about us. And she said, well, I do. And so from then she decided that she was gonna start this enrichment program. Now, here's what I can tell you about OGAD now. It now provides wraparound services for young people in the area. Miss Bailey started OGAD in the late 1960s, and her legacy continues on now as a private agency offering wraparound services, mental health services for young people. So this talk, I'm doing this in honor of her because she's the person, she's my shero, and she got me started as a social worker. She was one of the people who was really influential in my making the decision to become one. Today, this is really about looking at and speaking to the notions of working with community as opposed to doing to community. While those of us who are in the field, who are in the School of Social Work, we talk about best practices, we speak about getting your theoretical mindsets under your belt, having a good sense of where you want to go in the field, what directions you'd like to take, what services you'd like to provide, which populations you want to work with. And quite often what we also speak to is the notion of how do we partner with people. What I worry about sometimes is that we get stuck in the notion of we know, and sometimes the people we work with don't. So I think it's important to speak about how we do with as opposed to how we do to. And so a piece of what I'm going to do today is to speak to some of the history of people who had learned to do things in working with. I'm going to go back and I'm going to look back at some of the individuals who had shaped my life in some ways, and some individuals who shaped other people's lives. So the first person I want to speak to is Miss Ella Baker. Miss Ella Baker was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1903. On December 13th. She died in 1986 on December 13th. She was born in Littleton, North Carolina. She was head of multiple NAACP branches, and she also spearheaded some issues in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But what she also realized at one point is that as she was organizing conferences and having gatherings, that young people were coming and they had a different kind of energy. And what she suggested was the importance of these young people creating their own organization. And so she supported them to create SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Initially, their path was to begin to speak about and to want to move as students around the South to support people in sit-ins during the pre-civil rights era because of all of the issues that were happening in Jim Crow. And they began to speak about all of the spaces that they needed to be in. They thought about, how are we going to bring what we've learned in college into these communities to mobilize community members to stand up, to rise up so that they could reclaim some of their rights. And one of those people was Mr. Bob Moses. But the thing, let me back up for a second, I digress. The thing that Ms. Baker said that sort of set the stage for students was the major job was getting people to understand that they had something within their power that they could use. And it could be used only if they understood what was happening and how group action could counter violence. And this, in fact, set the stage for how the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee wanted to engage in sit-ins. And then this brings me to Dr. Bob Moses. Now, Dr. Bob Moses was born and raised in Harlem, and he went to school in New York State. And then as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee began to develop and arise, what they decided is they wanted to go to Mississippi. And they wanted to cover good portions of Mississippi with their organizing ideas. Dr. Moses, Bob then had studied philosophy. He had studied political science. He wanted to bring those ideas in the community. And he and his colleagues, when they went to the South, they ran into this man, Mr. Amzie Moore. Mr. Amzie Moore was born in 1911. He was born and raised in Grenada County, Mississippi, and he was from a sharecropping family. He went to school long enough to go to 10th grade because that's all they had. His mother, by the way, died when he was 14 years old. One of the things that Mr. Moore did, though, as he was growing up, once he got out of high school, was he went to work for the post office. And if you know anything about the post office, it being a federal job, it's a good paying job. And so what he did was he continued to save his money, and he eventually bought land and built a house. And he was the first Black person to build a house in his county. Now, Mr. Amzie Moore also was raised in the Jim Crow South in the early 1900s, and he believed that Black people were inferior. He believed that their place was one where they were to continue to be subservient. They were to continue their life of servitude towards white people, and that they were not to rise up and do other things. But then he got drafted into the United States Army. And when he went into the United States Army, he had a chance to go around the world. And one of the things that he found out when he was in the Army was that things were really different for everyone in different places in the world. And he came back from his time in the Army, and he started to do work in Mississippi. He ended up starting a general store in Cleveland, Mississippi. And people had issues with him about that. But the other thing that he did, he started to think about what Miss Ella Baker had said about people having place and people to understand that they had voice. And what he finally decided on, and when he sat down with Robert Moses at one point in time, he says, look, at the heart of Mississippi's race problem is the right to vote. And if we have the right to vote and we exercise that right to vote, we may be able to change a lot of things here in the state of Mississippi. He also went on to say that it was important for people to be able to read, because in order to be able to, if you could read, then you could read who was on the ballot, and then you can make a choice. What he also told Bob Moses was that you can't just study. You're going to have to meet and talk with people down here. You're going to have to get off your horse, off your theoretical mindset, and figure out how you could be with people in community, which means essentially you might have to wear some overalls. You might have to learn how to speak in some ways that you're not used to speaking, and you might have to listen to people in some ways you're not used to listening to them. So what Mr. Moore did with the SNCC organizers was bring them into spaces that he had begun organizing, into the connections that he had. He had in fact met with different church bodies over a space of time to speak about voting and voting rights and continue to read. And what he did was he started introducing Bob and other colleagues from SNCC to those people to have discussions around what we can do. And again and again, initially, what happened is that young Bob Moses ran into this question: why should we do this? Why should we even mess with white folks' business at all? We shouldn't be doing that. And one of the things that Bob had to do was figure out how he was going to respond. So the first year that Bob came down and worked with Mr. Ramsey Moore for a summer, he got a taste. He went back to New York State, completed a teaching internship, then left New York State and came back to Mississippi to continue his organizing with Mr. Moore. By that time, Mr. Ramsey Moore had done this. He had created a drive from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Together, they had decided that they were going to move to something called one man, one vote. And what you see in the upper right are some of the young organizers. So as you can see, many of them, if you're in your 20s, they're you. Maybe these men are in their 20s, but if you look, you can see Mr. Ramsey Moore. That's Mr. Ramsey Moore. This right here is young Bob Moses. That's Mayor Julian Bond. So these people, Mr. Ramsey Moore lived in Mississippi. Mr. Ramsey Moore lived in Mississippi. Okay, these young men did not. They came down. Mr. Moses came down. Mr. Bond was from the area, and so they started going across the state and they started speaking with people. And little by little, they started asking more and more students to come. So students came, white and black, they came to Mississippi. and they went into the communities, and they would ask questions, and they would say, we would really like you to think about getting registered to vote. Now, what they knew is that there were times when, if they were asking people to register to vote, that some of the white people in the area could very well shoot them. And in fact, Mr. Moses spoke about a time when one of his organizing friends had dropped him off in a space and was driving back to another part of Mississippi, only to be confronted by a man who shot his ear off and killed him in the street. And the black people were afraid to touch him, and the white people just walked past him. And so as a result of that, there are a lot of people who are thinking, this is a little bit risky. That's an understatement, right? We're thinking, I don't know if I want to do this at all. This is really scary. Why should we get involved in this? And in fact, at one point in time, Bob Moses had a wanted dead or alive poster put out on him, and people knew he was one of them young Yankee boys coming down to mess things up here in the South. One point in time, he got beat up pretty bad. And as you can see, the KKK decided to pay a reward for him if he was dead. But Mr. Moses never stopped. The organizers never stopped. And so essentially what they became known as the Freedom Riders. And so Freedom Riders were of multiple ethnicities, multiple identities, male and female. And whenever they sat down and they met with people, even at great risk to their lives, say, why should I do this? And Mr. Moses would say, according to Tom Hayden, when the people asked him what to do, he asked, what do you think? What do you think? How can we get you to have a buy-in? What makes sense to you? And that's when he began to learn that there are multiple ways to dice this thing up. Some people agreed with sit-ins. Other people thought that it might be better to cook food for folks who were going to agree to the sit-ins. Sometimes people were invested in training folks on what to do so they could be in the sit-ins. Sometimes there were people who agreed to go to churches to teach young people to read. Sometimes there are people who agreed that they would go and register to vote. And one of them was my grandfather. So briefly, I'm going to tell you about my grandfather. My grandfather was a self-employed plumber, and he lived in Meridian, Mississippi. Now, here's what's really fascinating about the story that I'm telling you now. I lived with my grandfather and my grandmother when I was 6 and 7 years old in Meridian. And what I'm about to tell you, all the things that I've told you in the last couple of minutes, they were circling around me as a little kid. And I had no idea. What's really fascinating for me about engaging in Sankofa has been to go back and to look and see what was happening when I was a child that helped to shape who I am now. So the Sankofa bird takes on huge meaning for me. So anyway, my grandfather more than likely registered to vote by some of these Freedom Riders. And when I was 7, he put myself, my younger brother, and my grandmother in his truck, and he drove from one side of Meridian, Mississippi to the white side of Meridian, Mississippi, where the polling place is. So let me say that again. My grandfather drove from one side of Meridian, Mississippi to another side of Meridian, Mississippi, where the polling place was. That should tell you a little bit of something about how votes were gerrymandered. So he pulls up in this parking lot, and this is the side of town I had never been to. But my grandfather knew about it because he's put people's toilets in and did plumbing for them over town. So he parks in this lot across the street from a high school. And he says to my grandmother, well, I guess I'm gonna go do this. And he gets out of the truck, and as he gets ready to close the door, my grandmother said, you be careful. And he says, I'll be all right. I'll put these people's toilets in. And he walked across the street, and there were several white men standing in front of, right at the edge of the sidewalk. And he walked up to them, and he had a talk with them. And then they parted ways, and he walked through, and he went in and he voted. Maybe about 10 or 15 minutes later, he came back, he got in the truck, and he said he did it. It took me a long time to realize what that meant because I thought everybody did that. And it wasn't until I started to go back and look and see what was happening during the era of poll taxes and the era of preventing Black people to have a vote that I realized what my grandfather had done. At great risk of his life, not unlike Mr. Bob Moses, he made a conscious choice to partake in citizenry. And thanks to Bob Moses and Miss Ella Baker and those people who came down to get people registered to vote, I'm standing here. I would also venture to say that a large portion of the organizing work that Miss Stacey Abrams did post her defeat in Georgia was probably taken exactly from these playbooks from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And more than likely, she studied Mr. Amzie Moore, and Miss Ella Baker, and all the people from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to gather the strategies that she engaged in so that she could get the vote that she did. So again, thank you. I'm going to shift gears again. I'm going to shift gears now to speak about someone who I became familiar with during my studies at Smith. This is Dr. Jessica Benjamin. She comes from, she's a psychoanalyst, but she comes from a school of psychoanalytic thinking that is beyond Freud, that speaks more to the notion of there being more than one, that there are two people in the room together. And so she wrote a paper on doing and done too. What she speaks to is this notion that when you're sitting in a therapeutic milieu, when it's you and a client, when it's you and someone else, that space is co-created. So essentially, there are things that I'm bringing as a therapist, and there are issues in life and things that you as the person who I'm working with is bringing, and together what we do is co-create meaning. And what we do is we initially come in as two different people, and as communication grows and as we co-create communication and understanding, there's this intersubjective space where all of a sudden we begin to have a new understanding, and we can create other ways of meaning, and we can also create new ways of understanding each other and understanding the world. She says this is a two-way street. And she says that all our mutual interests, influences are in the foreground. Okay, so whenever people look at me and they say, I can be objective when I'm sitting in psychotherapy, my response is, wonder how that works. Because what I know is that every person that has supported me in terms of my work as a psychotherapist, I bring with me when I'm sitting in the room with someone else. The challenge for me is to get to the space where I can pull back enough so that I can hear you. But I also bring with me everything. Likewise, you bring with you everyone that has supported you or hurt you or impacted you. You're bringing all that to the moment that we're sitting in. And together what we're doing is attempting to create together understanding and meaning. So I wanted to use Sweet Honey in the Rock as a way to speak about co-creation. So I have a brief video for you.
This next song is a spiritual, a traditional African-American song, which has a new arrangement brought to us by Carol Maillard, who is going to lead it. It's called Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. Sometimes
like a motherless child. Like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Like a motherless child. Oh, a long way from a home. Sometimes I feel like a long way from a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. 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 Feel like I'm almost gone. Almost gone a long way, a long way. Sometimes I feel just like I am almost gone a long way from home. I'm a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Calling out believer, true believer, true believer. Yes, I'm a long way from home. Calling out believer, true believer, true believer. Yes, I'm a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I am almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. A long way from home. You know that sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Feel like I'm almost gone. Almost gone a long way. I'm gone a long way. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long, long way from home. But I can hear my mother calling me. I can hear my mother. I can hear my mother's voice. I can hear my mother's voice calling me home. But I'm a long way. Yes, I'm a long way. I can hear my mother calling me home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, but I can't hear. I can hear my mother's voice calling me home across the waters. Come on home, cross the waters, child. I know I'm a motherless child. Yes, I'm a long way. I'm a long way. Sometimes I feel just like a motherless child. I'm a long way from home. I know that I'm a motherless child, a long way from home. I feel like a motherless child.
So here's the question. And I'm just going to speak about Sweet Honey in the Rock for a second. What we heard here, that's my understanding that you weren't able to see the video, apologies, was the essence of co-creating. Because there was meaning happening in multiple places. You could hear different voices adding and subtracting. You could hear different people raising their voice. You could also hear people bringing their passion. And each of the women in this group were working at creating a mutual understanding of how the song was moving, so that essentially what you were feeling was their passion and their longing, and there's communication being given between all of them. And that is that intersubjective space when you find yourself just leaning back into hearing and just being with your sister singers, that something magical happens. This is also the essence of intersubjectivity when we were doing psychotherapy, where the communication is given and received, and both of us are in that space. And sometimes magical things happen. Sometimes I get sometimes assertions come to me that normally wouldn't. Sometimes I may say something. Sometimes the person I'm sitting with may say something that piques me and piques us into a new understanding. Sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it's painful. I've sat with people who have spoken with me about horrendous events in their lives, and found myself tearing up, and realizing the importance of just being with that person as they walk through what they're doing, or they walk through an experience that was painful for them again and again. And when we were coming to an understanding about how that has affected them and what they want to do with it, that somehow that just being together with them allows them to feel heard. And so there are multiple ways to get at co-creating. Sometimes co-creating is about writing things down. We ask people to do journals sometimes. Sometimes those journals can give us insights. Sometimes there are no words. And so as a result of not having words, this is where art therapy comes in. This is where the notion of drawing something that is meaningful. Now, I got to tell you, I'm a stick figure artist. I'm a horrible artist. But if someone asked me to draw what I was feeling about a scary time, I could draw it and I could tell them. I could at least show them. When I ask little kids to draw me a happy day or a sad day, or draw something that was happening for them, they can tell me that way when they might not have the words. And then we can speak about how we create the words together. As you just heard, sometimes it's about singing. Sweet Honey in the Rock, we're speaking to the notion of feeling like a motherless child, and that longing for a place where someone was able to hold me. And I would venture to say, particularly in the time of COVID, particularly in the time of pain that we're in right now, the lack of contact with each other, the lack of physical touch, the kids who are not in school, not being able to see their friends. Some of the people that I know have been in their house. I've been in my house for the better part of a year, not going out hardly at all. And I think we're just hungry for that sense of connectedness. Sometimes we just need to cry. And tears, what we know about tears is that tears not only show pain, but they release toxins. And remember, I was telling you about the person that was telling me about this horrendous thing that they had lived with, and I found myself just crying. I was empathizing with the pain that this person had been through during this horrendous event. And I found myself not being able to hold back tears. And what I want to suggest to you is that sometimes not holding back tears is equally powerful, as long as you're not crying more than they are. Sometimes it's about hearing stories and telling stories. There are traditions of healing that emphasize storytelling. So later on, I'm going to bring up some stories as I talk about some of my work in the world. Sometimes it's about movement. Not every piece of intersubjectivity has words. Sometimes people just have to move. Sometimes it's dancing. There are some traditions where folks dance for the people. There are sometimes, so let me ask you this. Have you ever been to a jazz concert if you're a jazz head? Or have you ever been, if you're not a jazz head, have you been to a concert where the music was so good that you couldn't stop moving because it felt so good? That's the sense of co-creating. And that dance, letting your body go with the music is also another intersubjective space for us to be in. So I want to suggest that those intersubjective moves, those intersubjective times, those intersubjective events are ones in which when you tap into that, there's a piece of power there. There's also a sense of connectedness. And from there, once we have that connectedness and we have a mutual understanding, we can support each other and we can support the people we work with to rise to a different space. So the next person I want to speak to is Dr. Kimberlyn Leary. She's currently at Harvard University. She's also out of the psychoanalytic tradition. And one of the things that she has done, she wrote some papers on race and insult. She wrote a paper called Racial Insult and Repair that was absolutely phenomenal because she spoke to the notion of being a Black psychoanalytic therapist dealing with white families and dealing with people who sometimes would say things to her in the therapeutic hour that were really painful that she had to figure out what to do with. And then she also spoke about how she engages with colleagues who are not of African descent, and they say things that are harmful. And so she has to figure out how do I deal with those insults, and then how do I repair relationships when those things occur, or how does the other person need to work towards repairing relationships? But the thing that she spoke to in this case, and this is what I really want to emphasize here, is she spoke about young women of color. And so she says, many young women, including those from underrepresented communities, are very effective problem solvers. The truth is they know how to solve things. They've lived through it. But some hesitate to think of themselves as leaders. She then went on to say, by shining a light on these young women, leading change in their communities, especially those from diverse backgrounds, we send a strong message to other young women that they can be leaders in their own way, in their own style, and in the context of their own values. So the next thing I want to do is speak to a StoryCorps interview. And StoryCorps is one of those places where you get to hear a little snippet about a person's life. And this one in particular is about this woman named Dawn Maestas.
I was with a guy for 5 years. He was much older. He was really abusive towards me. After a while, when I tried to finally end it, he kidnapped me, held me hostage, and tattooed his name all over my body against my will.
Every time that you had to get dressed and undressed, you would have to look at that tattoo and know where it came from.
Yeah, that's when I called you.
I do laser tattoo removal. When you walked in my office, it was deja vu. I knew the loneliness, the embarrassment, and I was so angry that life had done to you what it had done to me. You know, I myself had a tattoo of my ex's name, and he'd make constant references to it all the time, that he owned me. This is a person who locks his arms around your legs at night, and you have to ask for permission to use the restroom. So, you know, it's not just a tattoo. It's like being in a car accident. Every time you pass that intersection, you remember the impact. How do you see yourself today versus the very first time you came in my office?
I don't feel like this prisoner in my body anymore. You just helped me in so many ways. You're my counselor, like my mom, my big sister. You already know what I'm going through.
I'm extremely honored that you let me be that person. You know, I can be thankful that I walked out with my life, but I've lost time that I will never get back. I spent 28 years living in violence. I think if she can do this faster, then she gets to enjoy so much more of her life that I lost. And I hope you know how much I care for you.
To be honest, I'm just like, who am I for her to care about so much? I'm just a nobody. But you remind me that I am somebody. And I don't feel alone.
That's all I could ask for. We're going to make it. I refuse to let us fall.
So Don Maestas is a tattoo artist, and she removes people's tattoos who've been in abusive situations. And what you just heard was her interviewing someone whose tattoo she had removed. As you could tell, this person was in an extremely abusive situation, and he wanted his name tattooed on her body as if she was his. And what Dawn did was help her to reclaim who she is, because she could hear that space. Can you hear the intersubjective moment here where we are hearing each other, and I'm going to support you in a way that allows you to rise above. You take this name off of your body, that means you get to reclaim it. That is the essence of intersubjectivity. That is a piece of the essence of how we do with, as opposed to do to. Now, the next thing I want to do is speak about some work that's near and dear to me. When I went to Smith, I thought about the types of dissertations I wanted to do, and those of you who have been in dissertation land, or those of you who are considering going to dissertation land, know that a piece of what you'll be doing is creating new thinking. But it's also important to note that the new thinking will probably be about this much in terms of all the thinking in the world. There are a number of ways to get at doing a dissertation. And according to many of my friends and colleagues, I took the long route, because what I wanted to do was hear from people who were multiracial, who had been transracially adopted by white parents. What we knew a lot before I did this dissertation was about how parents viewed their caretaking of multiracial kids. What we knew a little bit about is how multiracial kids fared, but what we didn't know was about who supported them in their racial identity development. And so that's what I went after. And so let me tell you who these people are. I interviewed people between 20 and 60 years old. Their first language was English. They were transracial adoptees, and they were adopted by white parents, and they must reside in the Pacific Northwest. So here they are. I did 11 interviews between 1 hour and 2 hours and 47 minutes. I interviewed nine women and 2 men. Of those 9 women and 2 men, 9 persons were of African descent and Caucasian. 1 person was identified as Native American and white, and the other person identified as Filipina and white. And what I wanted to get at was, what were the lived experiences of biracial and multiracial transracial adoptees before they explored their racial and ethnic identity. I also wanted to know, what experiences did biracial and multiracial transracial adoptees encounter as they explored their racial and ethnic identities. I wanted to know about social supports, what was helpful, and I also asked about what was not helpful. And then ultimately I asked, how do transracial adoptees understand and make meaning of their racial and ethnic identities? Here are the questions that I asked. Were there times in your life when you realized the social world you engaged in, racially, ethnically, and culturally, was different than their adoptive parents or family. How was it different? What were positive experiences and what were negative experiences? Is there more information you want to give me about that? I also asked about who facilitated exposure. What were some of the rules that you learned? What were the social supports? And what helped and what didn't? And so now I'm going to step into the intersubjective space and I'm going to speak about this, because one of the things that happened in the sort of research that I did was that I wanted to hear their stories. This is not a statistical dissertation. This was one where I wanted to foreground what these people told me. And so we'll start with this statement. We enter into stories. We are entered into stories by others, and we live our lives through these stories. We cannot perform meaning in our lives without situating our experience in stories. And for me, stories are the space where there are, I'll just say this, there are tons of information about my life. And so those of you who are in class with me, you know that I'm a storyteller. Those of you who have been around me know that I'm a storyteller, because I believe inside of those stories are ways of understanding the world, or ways of creating moral ideas, or ways of talking about what you should and should not do. There are also stories that are indicative of, here's an experience that you could potentially have, and here's an experience that I had that I created some meaning for. So I was just blank for a second, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience here of doing this dissertation, because what I came to was this level of honor about hearing people's stories. And there was one person that came, she came through my flyer, and one of my mentors in the world said, you need to go talk to Steve Wilson. So this is not her, but at one point in time, this is what her hair looked like as a young child, and she was raised in Spokane, and then moved to Pullman. And so she comes into the meeting with me, to the interview with me, and I said, hello, how are you doing? She says, fine. And she had a stack of pictures, and she had her high school yearbook, and she said, I thought a lot about what it was that you wanted, and so I decided to bring these with me. And she started by saying this. My aunt used to come to my house every summer and cut our hair. Now, I want you to think about this for a second, okay? This is the child. This is her hair. She lives in a white home, and her aunt just came to cut her hair. So then this is what she says. Everybody essentially got the same haircut, which is a bowl cut. And so then she showed me a picture, and she says, which is why you can see it's all one length. And then because my hair was really thick, they combed. Actually, I mean, they brushed it. It was a fight every morning for me. They brushed it out until there was no curl left. And then my aunt would use these things called thinning shears. Have you ever seen thinning shears? And I said, no, so I had to look them up. And I thought, oh my goodness, you did that to this child's hair? And so then she showed me a picture of her hair, and this raised a concern for me. And this is something that I know about many children who are transracially adopted. And those of you who are in the first year class, there's a film on transracial adoption where you see a young person whose hair is cut short. Now that's her choice, but what she also spoke about at one point in time was that I wanted to get my hair braided. And she was looking at her adoptive mother, who was saying, well, your mom used to braid your hair, at which point the young person goes, what? One of the challenges here around transracially adopting young people, particularly persons of African descent, is hair. So I'm just going to say this. This woman came in and brought these pictures. It was mind-boggling what had happened to her hair. That was just one of the pieces of issue that showed up. So I think what I'd like to do at this point in time is I'm just going to speak to a couple of things that occurred. And I'm going to show you the map eventually that they gave to me when they were speaking about their experiences. At the beginning of their sense of who they were and who they were becoming, there was always an event. Sometimes it happened in their adoptive homes where someone would say something to them. One person spoke to having been at school and on the bus, and someone looked at her and said she was Black. And then she went back home and she said, "Dad, I'm Black." And her father went and got one of his black shoes and said, "This is Black. You are not Black." So peer interactions in adoptive homes are places where these things happen. Another person spoke about adults in the community who would look at them and say, and why are you here and how do you belong? One person in the study said to me, because we lived in a multiracial, multi-ethnic home, I had 8 brothers and sisters, and there were 3 of us who were African descent, but I had a brother who was Asian Pacific Islander. I had other brothers who were Latinx, and she said we got it. We had those discussions amongst ourselves inside the house, but we were seen as this unusual group of people walking around in the town where we lived. Many of the respondents said, I knew because my parents are white. I got it. I know. They always said, every person in the study said, other kids pointed it out to me. Many times adults asked, who are you and how do you fit? This led to losses for people. And there were losses in terms of interpersonal interactions. And it happened in terms of things like literally from school to elementary school to college. So I'm gonna pull up some things on losses for a second because I actually have the study right here. I'm just gonna pull up some of the things that they said. Okay. There's one person and I use pseudonyms, so there's one person in college, Martha spoke about an experience where she hoped she would receive support, but did not in the way she had hoped for. She said, I asked her what wasn't supportive, and she said, I didn't have language to navigate situations. I mean, like when people say something racist and you don't even know if I could identify if it was racist back then, like someone says something that they felt like bad, but not knowing what to say or how to say it, that's where I feel like someone like my dad would be like, this is not okay, but it didn't happen. So sometimes you come with me to school and your dad's going to take care of it kind of thing. And like, I didn't have that. I didn't have that sort of backup. Because I think if I had somebody who was active in that part of my life, I feel like I would have had more support or backup, but I felt kind of out there. I want to speak about siblings for a second, because sometimes what happens with siblings, and there was one point where this one person spoke to his brother, because he was the only African American in the home, only mixed race person of African descent and Caucasian descent in his home, and he had a younger brother. Now, the person I was speaking with was on the debate team, and he was a really good athlete. And his younger brother wasn't on the debate team, nor was he a really good athlete. And so sometimes the younger brother would say, "Well, that's my brother, and he's really cool." And folks look at him and say, that can't be your brother. So all of a sudden, this white kid who knows this is his brother finds himself having to fight with other kids. And he was getting in trouble all the time for fighting. And my respondent says, I felt horrible for him because he was having to defend me in ways that no one should have to. Many folks spoke about the notion of, you talk funny. Why do you speak that way? Not understanding that if I'm raised in a home where we don't speak in a certain vernacular, that doesn't mean I'm funny. It just means I speak different. A lot of people didn't know what to do to code switch. And I also already spoke about the notion of not being able to engage in racially charged situations. So this is another view of losses, and I'm just going in one space here. I'm just going to speak about one space. So one respondent says somehow she thought she was doing a good thing by adopting a little colored child, but at the same time, she essentially professed to be colorblind. So they weren't supportive of me. So then I said, you said you're in a different world. You'd hang out with student athletes and then come home. She says, oh yeah. I'll always be like that because I never wanted to come home, because when I came home, that became the actual infraction was being late. And so that's the pointer to say that's the problem? She says, yeah, versus the fact that they were very uncomfortable with me. I think my mother was worried that I would be unsafe out there. I mean, there are a number of, high school girls with little brown children. That would not have been an anomaly. She didn't understand my position there. I barely understood it. Now there's another space here that I'm going to speak to for a second, because this is when things started to shift. This very same person that talked about her mother not understanding told this story. And she said, I was playing basketball right next to an apartment building, and there were a number of black athletes who lived in that apartment building. And I was shooting baskets, and this one black athlete leaned out the window and he says, hey, what are you doing over there with them white people? And this is when she started to break down and cry during the interview with me. And she said that was the first time someone had ever really noticed me, and I felt claimed. And from there, people started to bring me into the circle of athletes, that other persons of color had acknowledged who I was. So I know that I'm running on time here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward here for a second, and I'm going to speak about lessons learned. Actually, no, I'm going to give you I'll come back. That's what I'm going to do. I want to speak about what happened once these people gained information on themselves and went through a process of understanding who they were as multiracial individuals. Because that sense of self allowed them to go back and give back to people. So one person, one of the male respondents said to me, I understand myself as a black man, but I also understand that I stand between spaces, that sometimes I'm standing as a person of color, and sometimes people look at me and they say, are you Mexican? Are you Hispanic? Are you Arab? But I understand myself as a black man. Another person spoke about this notion of dealing with coloration, that because she was more light-skinned than some of her darker black compatriots, that they would say stuff about her. The other thing I think that was really potent for some people was they spoke to the notion of sometimes being in and sometimes not being in, as in, I don't understand what it means to be black. That was not my experience. And even though morphologically I look a certain way, I don't understand this. There was one person in this study. This was the shortest interview, and this was probably for me one of the more profound ones, in addition to the one that I've been speaking about. And this was a woman who was identified as Asian Pacific Islander and Caucasian, and she said she married she grew up in the area where I live in Lacey, and she spoke about having gone to school down here and had very little interest in learning about her identity. But then when she went away to college, she joined the Filipino American Club. She joined the Filipino Club at school, and what she found out is that because she didn't understand Tagalog and she didn't know about the food, that what they did was essentially they made her part of the student senate, and they sent her as a representative to the student senate so that she would have a role. But when she would ever come back to report, they sort of ignored her, at which point she felt really pained and decided that she didn't want to be part of that organization again. Well, she finished college, she became a teacher, she got married, and she married a white man, and they had 2 children. One looks more Filipino and one looks more Caucasian. So when her her second child was born. He's the one whose complexion-wise and morphologically looks more Caucasian. She looked at the OBGYN who had helped birth the child and said, when she was on the birth certificate, she said, what ethnicity should I say? And the doctor looked at her and she looked at the child and she said, say he's white. And the pain on this woman's face was so incredibly palpable, and the silence in my room was so incredibly palpable that she after about 3 minutes just got up and said, I have to stop this interview, and she walked out. And when I went to send her the transcript, she didn't get back to me. I haven't spoken to her again. Because there she was sitting in a space where she knows I'm this child's mother, but she was also dealing with, how are people going to acknowledge me? How are people going to see me? How are people going to see my child? How are people going to acknowledge that I'm this child's mother? It was so incredibly painful. With the exception of this person, everyone decided to give back. They decided that a piece of what they wanted to do was to increase other people's understanding of who they were. These were the people who gave back in community. They gave back to their students. One of them has worked with their daughter to reclaim their native ancestry. In fact, they went and did a documentary film on going back because they had found their birth family records. They had found the tribe that they were part of. They became enrolled and they went back, and this woman gave this gift to her daughter to say, here's what your heritage is. And the daughter made a documentary film on it. Finally, they also spoke to this notion of giving voice to issues that are of concern, and also speaking, and they were willing to speak with potential adoptive parents. So after all of this, what ended up happening is that as I looked at all the interviews, I created a roadmap for how these people approach this. There's a process here. And so essentially there were events that occurred for them. And then they didn't have information about who they were. And once they found that out, they had losses. Sometimes they experienced anger. Sometimes they experienced marginality in the communities they lived in or people they engaged with. Then they worked on searching for their identity. And those searches happen between, sometimes they receive support for those searches from other persons of color, sometimes from their birth family, but undoubtedly they went on this search. Then they did some internal work as they began to understand. As they began to understand what their identities meant to them, they began to do internal work for themselves, and they gained a much more positive sense of themselves. And ultimately, what they decided to do, with the exception of the one person I talked about because of where she was in her own process, they decided to give back. So these are the lessons that I have learned over the course of my time in terms of working with. It's really important to be with people. And this is, from my perspective, this is really about how can I just be in space with someone and just breathe and sync my breathing up and attend to them. How can I be a witness for them? Sometimes one of the most potent things that we can do with the people in the communities that we're working with is to be a witness to their struggle. We might not have to do anything. They might, however, believe that we're supposed to be there to do something, so they're going to ask us what we're going to do. But first, we have to understand and be witness to what they're feeling challenged by. And then we have to acknowledge what it is that we have witnessed and seen. In acknowledging that, that supports people to believe that this is that either this is wrong or this is potent or it really did happen. And when that occurs for people, that sense of acknowledgement gives back to them in ways that sometimes I can't even fathom, but it has been a really potent thing to be witness to someone when they're pain and to say, I see that, I see you, and I see you as bigger than that, but I see you because I hear this experience happen with you. And I can just watch them say, thank goodness someone believed me. And to forefront their voice. As you can see, many throughout this, what I've worked on is that intersubjective space where I am listening and co-creating, but I am also bringing up the notion of the importance of that your voice counts. I hear your voice. Your voice means something. And the truth is, most people know what works. That's what Mr. Ansley Moore was telling Bob Moses and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee when they came down to organize sit-ins. He said, we know what can work. Let's do this. This will be better. And then ultimately, we need to get out of their way. Because if we get out of their way, because it's their life, if we get out of their way, they're going to go ahead and do their thing. So I want to thank you. And that's the end of the show.
Thank you so much, Steve. Man, I have so many ideas flowing from my head right now, and I see virtual applause. And I just want to send a thank you out to those of you on watching this on YouTube. Like and subscribe as always, right? And if you missed it, you can come back and watch this later. But thank all of you for joining us on the live stream. And now we are going to go back to our Zoom with our students. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Now we have